Tonight on Greater Boston from the Boston Public Library, we're getting a sneak peek at the new Frontline documentary about the brave group of Russian resistors who've been speaking out against Vladimir Putin's Ukraine invasion despite the life-altering risks. Filmmaker Gesbeen Mohammad joins me. Plus, Elon Musk is now at the helm of Twitter, and he appears to have brought his permissive views on hate speech and misinformation with him. So what does that mean for the state of American democracy with Election Day nearing and beyond? Russia has been ramping up its attacks on infrastructure facilities across Ukraine, including in the capital Kyiv, where hundreds of thousands were without power or water for hours as a result this week. Russian forces are also targeting regions to the east and south, and Ukrainian officials say fighting is intense on the front lines in the far eastern city of Donetsk. But despite all that, Russian President Vladimir Putin declared yesterday that the government was going to stop enlisting new fighters. That draft process sparked rare signs of resistance in Russia, with protests and many military-age men leaving the country. And a small minority of Russians are still openly opposing the war in general, despite the very real possibility of imprisonment for speaking out.
За слова «нет войне», они у нас считаются экстремизмом, тебя могут посадить на 10-15 лет в тюрьму. Это хорошо объясняет то, почему сотни тысяч, например, не выходят на протест. Всех, кто не согласен, у нас избивают, арестовывают, сажают в тюрьму, пытают и так далее.
Those brave resistors are the subjects of the latest Frontline documentary, Putin's War at Home, which premieres tonight on PBS. I'm joined by the film's producer and director, Gesbeen Mohammad. Gesbeen, it's a pleasure to have you, and congratulations on the film.
Thank you for having us.
Were you surprised that people like those you profile in the film, a professor, journalists, ordinary people, were willing to say what they were willing to say on camera?
Yes. I mean, as soon as we started making this film, it was very apparent that the atmosphere of sort of fear had grown so much in Russia, and that it would be very difficult to get people to talk about their opposition to the war on camera. We were lucky to find these individuals who are extremely brave for taking part in this film.
And by the way, they know exactly what they're facing. Here's a little back and forth with the two journalists you profile, Olga and Galena. Here they are.
Понимаете ли вы, что вы потенциально рискуете уголовным наказанием на срок от 8 до 15 лет за распространение недостоверной информации о российских вооруженных силах, также за сотрудничество с иностранными медиа?
Я понимаю, что потенциально я могу быть наказана.
Я понимаю, что могу быть наказана.
Заняв такую позицию, в принципе, мы можем, наверное, сломать себе всю жизнь.
Could you describe what those two journalists were doing?
Olga and Yelena are two very, very brave journalists who go around Siberia and investigate Russian fighters who have died in the war in Ukraine. Now Putin has obviously declared that a state secret. So what they're doing is essentially defying the orders that Putin has laid down since the war in Ukraine.
And it's motivated by the fact that they believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, they believe that if the Russian public knew how intense the casualties were, that their support for this war would start to disappear. Is that not correct?
Precisely. So what they say in the documentary is that essentially the Russian state is trying to convey to Russians that there are no consequences for Russians in terms of this war. But in fact, they say the war has entered every Russian's home already.
And we should be clear, this is not just dangerous what they are doing. These are crimes under new Russian laws that are punishable with very serious consequences.
Yes, absolutely. So after the war started, Russians took to the streets, and within 10 days, Putin effectively criminalized opposing the war and independently reporting on it.
You know, some of the scenes, Sonia, who we just saw a couple of minutes ago, her partner, Sasha, has been imprisoned. And some of the most touching scenes, the support for people who go to the courthouse, the heart shape that Sasha makes with her hand while she's in this cage in the courtroom. But please share with people, if you would, what's the crime for which she is in the midst of being punished? What has she done that offends the Russian state?
Well, Sasha, being an artist and someone who had protested when the war started, and when it became impossible to protest, she decided to replace supermarket stickers with stickers that essentially contained information about what was happening in Ukraine. And obviously to us, this is very sort of innocuous, but she's now facing up to 10 years in prison for this sort of act of defiance.
You know, one of the things that was most amazing to me is the unimaginable courage of the people you spoke to, and I know they're not the only ones, obviously. But one of the most painful parts to me was Natalia, who has done this remarkable work on TikTok, and the professor, whose name I forget for a moment, whose parents are still in Ukraine. They're not just dealing with Putin, they're dealing with their own families. Correct me if I'm wrong, Natalia's mother and the professor's 13-year-old daughter, as of the moment, are buying the Putin line and combating their own, in one case, kid, in another case, parent with this crap. Are they not?
Yes, I mean, I guess because of the sort of increasing censorship and propaganda inside Russia, families are really being torn apart because some Russians don't have any exposure to Western media. And so the ones that essentially only get fed state media end up believing essentially the propaganda that Russia is disseminating. And that's really tearing families apart.
Do you have any idea? I mean, I think we're 9 months in. I hope I have the count right, but it's been a really long time. Do you have any idea as to whether or not this resistance is growing? I'm assuming, as I said at the top of this, that Putin would not be backing off this recruitment thing where they were picking up men off the street who were busking or sitting outside at a cafe. He wouldn't be backing off that if he wasn't getting blowback. Is the movement growing as best you can tell?
Well, based on what we sort of gathered on the ground, it seemed that when Putin announced mobilization on the 21st of September, many people took to the streets and mothers came out, wives came out in support of their husbands. They didn't want their men to be called up to fight in Ukraine. That has slowly died down. What we've seen is obviously a response from Russia, but what we've seen is also the tightening of screws. Again, people are too afraid to go out and publicly oppose the war because of the heavy sentencing that they might be exposed to.
So do you, other than I mentioned a minute ago, and anybody who sees the film will feel the same way, the incredible courage of ordinary people, and I don't mean ordinary in a pejorative way, I mean just average people who have a commitment to something that really matters. Other than the courage, is there a common thread, do you think, among all the people who you profile?
I think all of them, I mean, obviously there is bravery, but all of them had this sense of injustice that obviously in relation to the war in Ukraine, but not also in relation to themselves. Their rights have been taken away from them. There is no freedom of speech left for them in Russia. They can't express themselves freely. So I guess Putin's war at home really was a way for them to take back their voices. They have no other platforms to really express themselves.
You know, I know you've done a lot of films where you've gone inside countries that were impenetrable to most journalists. Do you pause for a minute when you're either making a film like this or in between and think about what separates? I mean, there are a lot of people, I'm sure, who share the feelings of the handful of people you profile in this film. Do you think about what separates those of us who have the courage to act, which I'm not sure I would have, from those who just harbor it inside and can't bring themselves to do it?
That's a really difficult one to answer, but it's a good question. I think every authoritarian society has people who are willing to essentially fight, obviously peacefully, for what they believe in. And I think it's often people who have had a lot taken away from them. And for example, Sonia, her partner, has been taken away from her. Roman, he's separated from his family. He doesn't know when he's going to be able to see his parents ever again. And so I think they've gotten to a point where there isn't, I suppose, much to lose. They want to be able to live just the way you and I live here in the West.
Well, all I can say is your film is terrific and important, and I urge everybody watching to watch it later tonight. Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Gesbeen Mohammad's film for Frontline, Putins War at Home, premieres here on GBH2 and on the PBS YouTube page tonight at 10. It's also streaming now at pbs.org and in the PBS video app. Next up, as you've likely heard by now, Twitter is under new management. And in the short time since Elon Musk took over, then fired the whole board, giving himself total control, the platform has already grown more toxic. And the real-life consequences of that are growing more concerning. While Twitter has never been known as a bastion of civil discourse, since news of Musk's takeover broke, a social media research group found a 500% increase in use of the N-word as racist trolls think they can now get away with it, and so far, many have. In fact, Twitter suspended certain content moderation tools, according to Bloomberg News, and quote, most people who work in Twitter's trust and safety organization are currently unable to alter or penalize accounts that break rules around misleading information, offensive posts, and hate speech in a majority of cases. And the timing could not be worse. A week out from Election Day, with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's husband still recovering from a brutal beating spurred by online conspiracy theories, at least one of which was briefly spread by the self-proclaimed chief twit himself, Elon Musk. So is this another nail in the coffin of American democracy? I'm joined by Michelle Amazine. She's the director of the Communication Research Center at BU, and Arkan Fung, director of the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard's Kennedy School. It's good to have you both. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.
Michelle, starting with you, for the dwindling number of us who actually still care about the preservation of democracy in this country, how much concern should we have about Musk's takeover of Twitter?
Well, I think it's definitely a concern when one individual takes over such an important platform in our society. At the same time, I think we also need to keep in mind that less than 25% of Americans use Twitter.
Well, but I would say back to that, only 5 million people at its peak watch Fox News every night, and its impact goes far beyond those 5 million people, does it not?
Well, it does, and that's why it's important for us to take into consideration our media architecture, or our media infrastructure. So with social media sites such as Twitter, they can easily pick up information from fringe websites, amplify it, and then the mainstream media amplifies it even more.
It does indeed. Arkan, how concerned are you about Musk's new role?
I am concerned about Musk's new role, but Twitter was never an ideal public square to begin with. And in terms of billionaire control, I think, many of the social platforms and many of the legacy media organizations, from the Hearst papers to the Washington Post to the New York Times, were also controlled by very wealthy private individuals.
So where does that leave you, Arkan? I mean, for example, I have spoken to the former editor of the Washington Post and the current editor of the Boston Globe, the latter of which is owned by a very wealthy man, John Henry, the former of which is owned by an uber-wealthy individual, Jeff Bezos, and both editors told me they infused a lot of money into the papers and gave total freedom to the editors and reporters to do what they did, that they couldn't be doing the kind of journalism they were doing without that kind of support.
And I think therein lies the critical difference, is what is the motivation of management and control? And many of the legacy newspapers benefit from a motivation of professional journalism and actually getting to the truth. Whereas social media, not just Twitter, but a lot of social media, the main motivation is to maximize ad revenues. And that has, if there has any relation to the truth, that's completely incidental.
Can we talk about ad revenues for a second, Michelle? I think most people have learned, if they didn't know in the last few days, 90% of the revenues for Twitter come from advertising. General Motors suspended its advertising, even though most people think it's because they're a competitor with Tesla, more than an act of great principle. But even if it didn't become the free-for-all hellscape, to use Musk's words, that he promised advertisers it would not become, even if it did become that and they left and they didn't advertise, is it possible that Musk doesn't really care about the money? He more cares about having a platform to elect the Donald Trump, or what he says, the guy he says is his favorite candidate, Ron DeSantis. Is that not possible?
I guess it's possible. I think his main motivation is profit. He wants to, I guess, reconfigure Twitter in some respects to maximize profit. He sees it as having, it's not being properly utilized or properly configured, and he believes he's the guy to turn it around and to make it more profitable by adding different features. We hear now that they're going to be charging for verification services. So he does want to pivot away, not pivot away. He wants to add on to all the ad revenue by having subscription-based services.
But is it, you know, Archon, I don't know if you buy Michelle's thesis, but it seems to me that relaxing content moderation is not the way to attract new advertisers. It's a way to scare them off the platform, no?
Well, I think his motivations, whether it's profit maximization or advancing what his political views, will become clear later. I don't think we know what those are exactly, but either of those views is horribly damaging to democracy, whether it's profit maximization or a billionaire advancing his political views using the world's biggest megaphone. Both are terrible for democracy.
You know, for those who don't quite understand yet, I mean, it's easy to understand a 500% increase in the appearance of the N-word. But for those, I've spoken to a lot of people who say, well, I don't really quite understand what's the consequence of lax moderation. I would say the first example that I took away was Musk himself. And we can put up, he retweeted in response to something Hillary Clinton said about the assault on Nancy Pelosi's husband. He tweeted, there's a tiny possibility there might be more to the story than meets the eye. And of course, he was referring to a piece in the discredited Santa Monica Observer, a scandalous story about whatever went on. And 3 hours later, Michelle, he pulled it down. I would argue if the rules that existed before Musk took over were still in place about encouraging violence, he would have had to ban himself from his own damn site. So is that not a really ominous sign that one of the first tweets we see from Musk himself?
It absolutely is. I would say, Elon, don't post unverified news.
What do you worry most, Archon, what do you worry most about in terms of this content, the moderation relaxation, which seems to be the greatest concern of the greatest number of observers of Twitter's operation?
Yeah, I think that what I worry about is the downsizing of teams that are whose purpose it is to make Twitter a better place. And part of that is the moderation to prevent hate and harm. I would love it if there were 200 engineers at Twitter who were for a full-time job thinking about how can we make Twitter a place that's good for democracy, where people listen to each other, where they try to find out true things, and they try to do their civic job.
You know, there's a long-term issue here too, Archon, but it seems to me the most dangerous immediate concern is the immediate future. We have 7 days till an election. Could Musk's control of the platform generate the kind of misinformation that many of us fear are determining outcomes these days in such a short period of time?
I would be more worried about how things shape up for 2024. I think it's possible that things could get a lot worse in the 7 days, but there's many channels for misinformation in that short amount of time.
You know, Michelle, speaking of 2024, Donald Trump, as is the case, praised Musk's takeover, said he was not interested. He loves Truth Social, but of course, you count the numbers. He's got 4 million followers on Truth Social. He had 88 million followers on Twitter, so I'm assuming he would want back if Musk were to say, you're welcome back, which he has intimated he would do. As a matter of public policy, I totally support the notion of banning citizen Trump because of the danger he poses to democracy and the encouragement of violence. Can a platform like Twitter make a case that a candidate, Trump, should he declare for the presidency, should be barred from the site as opposed to just putting warnings on some of the things he says?
I'm sure they could make that case.
Should they?
that he should be candidate Trump
If
should be
he
banned?
decides to run, is there a public policy argument that even a candidate for president should be banned from a site that is as huge as this is?
Well, I think, sure, there could be that case. If the candidate is inciting violence and we're seeing real world consequences of misinformation leading to people being attacked, as Paul Pelosi was, I think that there is a case for that.
Arkan, do you agree with that?
I think there's a case for that. Many of my friends and colleagues, I think, would agree with that case. I don't happen to agree with that particular case. I think if Donald Trump became a candidate, he ought to have access to major social media platforms. Those platforms should put up content warnings of all kinds, and there should be very robust opportunities to respond. Otherwise, I think the conversation goes into pretty dark places.
You know, for the last couple of minutes we have, Michelle and Arkan, could you speak, starting with you, Michelle, if you were sort of the czar of social media platforms like this, what would you do to address the concerns you have of an Elon Musk, not just Musk at Twitter, but similar sorts of things? What could be done to protect free speech without the kind of free speech that has great potential to cause great damage to our society? Is there anything that can be done?
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question, Jim. I don't think there's an easy answer. I would advise Elon to gather a diverse advisory board who can counsel him on different considerations for this. I don't think there's an easy answer, which is why we're still grappling with this for years now.
So, Arkan, do you have an answer, easy or not? I mean, as you know, one of the few things, for different reasons, that both Biden and Trump agreed upon was to repeal that Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which basically said that the owners of platforms like Twitter are immune from suit for third-party content. Is that a solution, or is there a solution, Arkan?
Well, I agree with Michelle that there's no simple solution. I think the very first step is that Elon Musk and owners of other large social media platforms need to say, we have a large public responsibility to do what we can for democracy, and we have been doing very, very little to fulfill that responsibility. And the only way for that to happen is for, I believe, outside pressure, public policy pressure from government, pressure from citizens who are upset about how social media is creating a toxic communication environment.
Well, quickly, Arkan, what's the stick that government and average people, users of Twitter, have to effectuate change? What do they have?
They could regulate. I would love to see a 1% tax on all social media profit to fund fact-based journalism for you and many others in your business. At the end of World War II, I think a bunch of U.S. companies media companies got it together to do their bit for democracy because they were looking at Europe and the BBC, and they said, we didn't want to be socialized. We want to remain private companies.
Unfortunately, I'm out of time, Michelle. I'll have to do it next time. But thank you both for your thoughts. I really appreciate your time. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. As we discussed yesterday, the U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments this week in a case that accuses Harvard and the University of North Carolina of discrimination against white and Asian American applicants by holding them to higher standards. GBH News' Kirk Carapezza visited one Boston suburb to talk with students and teachers about college admissions, the ongoing case, and whether they think colleges considering race is ultimately fair.
We're flipping around our agenda here.
Inside veteran teacher Brian Keeney's journalism class at Wayland High School, students debate the merits of the Harvard case. How would you describe the college admissions process here in Wayland?
Hunger Games comes to mind as an appropriate metaphor here. That the kids really are obsessed with it in a way that I don't remember people being obsessed with it when I was younger.
which in part is why many students here are paying close attention to a discrimination case now before the Supreme Court that could spell the end of race-conscious admissions at selective private and public colleges. At issue is whether Harvard discriminates against high-performing Asian Americans. If the court decides it does, it could make more room for white and Asian American students to be admitted to colleges, while decreasing admissions of Black and Latino students. Between her classes, Wayland High sophomore Reva Datar tells me at home she and her parents discuss the Harvard case a lot.
We talk about it almost daily because, it's just a really big part of my life, and it's like college is what I'm working towards.
The daughter of highly educated Indian immigrants, Datar says she believes Harvard and other selective colleges she hopes to attend someday hold Asian Americans like her to higher academic and personal standards. That's why she's taking all of her classes at the highest level, seeking coveted internships and enrolling in summer pre-college programs.
I definitely think that I'm losing sleep. Just mentally thinking about it tires me out.
In this competitive atmosphere, schools have to remind students to relax and maintain perspective. So Wayland High is increasingly focused on mental health. To help ease anxiety about college admissions, administrators have added additional staff and professional development to support overall wellness. They've also brought in this therapy dog. And the high school has long featured a so-called wall of shame in a common area where students publicly post their rejection letters.
Students need to learn how to fail.
Allison Mizuguchi is the principal at Wayland High.
They need to learn how to listen to other students who have differing viewpoints. They need to do so many other things besides do whatever they can do to get a particular grade.
Mizuguchi's father was born in a Japanese internment camp during World War II, and she says Asian Americans still face discrimination in American society. But she's not sure whether selective colleges show bias against them.
I don't know. But if the outcome is a diverse community where folks are able to interact in really healthy and strong ways with one another, hopefully with people that they would not have ever interacted with before.
In predominantly white Wayland, over the past 20 years, the percentage of Asian students at the high school has more than doubled, from 6 to 15%. A Black Lives Matter banner hangs in the cafeteria, but the percentage of black students here has remained flat, hovering around 4%. In the end, all of the students we interviewed here said they value racial diversity and think colleges should be able to consider race, including Reva Datar.
It's impossible to have an acceptance process that does not consider race because our society is so built on race. I do think that you should get in based on your hard work and how much effort you put in as a student.
So as Datar and many others watch the Supreme Court case closely, they hope whatever the outcome, their hard work pays off. For GBH News, I'm Kurt Carapezza.
That's it for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget Ukraine.
Who created